Over time, and I still occasionally listen to NPR because I just want to hear what they have to say, and I don't even recognize the station anymore. It's not news. I feel like it's propaganda. I feel like there's disinformation every time I listen to NPR. And, a media entity like MSNBC or Huffington Post that, in my opinion, consistently spews disinformation, they can do that. They're a private company. But NPR gets federal funds. And I have a problem with that.
Though the battle to defund public broadcasting networks like NPR and PBS is not new to the Republican Party, it is undeniable that Donald Trump's hostility towards anyone who dare question him, especially a media professional or journalist, has kicked the demonization of these outlets into overdrive, resulting in the clown show of a hearing led by one of MAGA's biggest clowns, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
And I do believe there was a role for public radio 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. But because of technology today, I don't think there's a role for public radio anymore. And I think you've abused the privilege that you had with receiving federal funds. Because these headlines here are not true. This is disinformation on some huge topics. Okay. Do you want to dispute anything that I said in the remaining 30 seconds?
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I want to recognize your concerns. One of the first things that I did in coming in May was to beef up our editorial standards. I directed my editor-in-chief, who, by the way,
why is NPR even doing editorials?
I'm so sorry.
Even do editorials?
I don't mean editorial in terms of opinion editorial.
Do you even need opinion? What does it matter with the opinion? If you're a federally funded entity that's supposed to provide the news, can you not provide the news?
Of course,
fair and balanced?
Of course, Congressman. I mean, editorial standards for our journalism was to beef up our editorial practices, bringing in more editors to make sure that we have more points of view reflected in every story. I've engaged in a number of actions trying to address
and my
some of
time's
these
expired.
concerns.
I've lost confidence in public radio. I don't think, Madam Chair, they should get a penny of federal funds.
This is where our country is at. A sitting congressman attacking government-sponsored news outlets that more often than not align with the interest of the political establishment, all the while confusing an editorial article with the concept of editorial standards. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. MAGA is not legitimately invested in gutting NPR and PBS because they cost too much money to operate, but rather wanting to gain as much control over the information the American public receives as they possibly can. And by hiding behind Doge and buzzwords like waste, fraud, and abuse, they can conceal their true motivations and posture to their base like they're working for them, when in reality, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Mr. Gonzalez, you wrote the proposal to defund NPR, PBS, and public broadcasting for Project 2025. Can you answer a few questions for me? How many millions of dollars a month do taxpayers spend for Daniel Tiger to play golf?
I have no idea.
The answer is none.
Okay.
To your knowledge, has Miss Piggy ever been caught trying to funnel billions of dollars in government contracts to herself and to her companies?
That's a silly question.
Well, the answer is no. How about Arthur the Aardvark? Has he ever fired independent government watchdogs who are investigating his companies? The answer is no. Madam Chair, I'm told we're here to talk about government efficiency, but Daniel Tiger has not blown $10 million of taxpayer money to play golf with his friends, but Donald Trump has, just at the beginning of his administration. Miss Piggy hasn't been caught funneling billions of dollars in government contracts to herself, but Elon Musk has, and Arthur has not fired independent government watchdogs investigating him and his companies. But Elon Musk has fired at least 5. So once again, my Republican colleagues are dragging in a scapegoat, this time PBS and NPR, to try to distract from the fact that Trump and Musk are robbing working people. It's Sesame Street that's making things expensive. It's Mr. Rogers that's blowing taxpayer money. It's listeners like you. It's absurd.
The gag is, all those people, all those scenarios, it involves Donald Trump and Elon Musk. So they don't care about waste. They don't care about fraud. They don't care about corruption. They would lead you to believe If you're drinking their Kool-Aid, they will lead you to believe that, oh, these characters and PBS, NPR, they are terrible creations and they need to be defunded. They serve no good purpose.
The total funding for public broadcasting is just 1/6 the amount that Elon Musk's companies make off of the government every single year. But you will not see Elon Musk being grilled by this committee. I've seen a lot, but pointing the finger at Elmo to cover for Elon Musk might be a new low for Miss Marjorie Taylor Greene's committee. I don't think Americans are buying it.
Well, you look at that. According to a Pew Research Center survey, Americans are more likely to support than oppose continuing federal funding for NPR and PBS. 43% to be exact, right? Support PBS and NPR to continue to receive funding, while 24% want Congress to remove federal funding. What's also interesting is the breakdown among political parties. So 44% of Republicans and people who lean to the right, they say Congress should end funding for NPR and PBS, while 19% say funding should continue. Now, when you look at the Democrat side, right, Democrats and Democratic leaners, just 5% of them say federal funding should be cut off, while 69% say funding should continue. And you have 26% who are not sure, and for Republicans, it's 37% who are not sure. This is not surprising, people, because we know, even though there are issues with the Democratic Party, they understand the importance of stations like NPR and PBS. They know what it does for our children. They know what it does for our literacy, right? And media literacy and trusting federally funded organizations. And they're not trying to drink any Kool-Aid from their party whatsoever. On the Republican side, oh, they are. That's why it's not a surprise that they want to remove federal funding, because they don't want anything that's rooted in facts. What they want is propaganda. Whatever Donald Trump says, whatever Elon Musk says, whatever J.D. Vance says, that is what they want to be communicated in all aspects, right? So if PBS and NPR are not kissing the ring, then they need to go, because they're not serving the purpose of the president. They're not giving us what we want to hear.
After Trump and Musk took over the government, reporters noticed that the State Department was trying to funnel $400 million taxpayer dollars to Tesla. The State Department said it's an old contract, no news here. But because of a brave whistleblower and an NPR reporter, they exposed the corruption and the lies. Madam Chairwoman, if we want to look into waste, fraud, and abuse, why not look into that? Elon Musk, who's running cabinet meetings, who's running the White House, was trying to funnel money to himself. So let's stop investigating Cookie Monster and start investigating how the Trump administration lied about this and was trying to funnel money to their biggest political supporter. Maybe you're trying to defund NPR because they expose this kind of corruption. And if Republicans were serious about investigating waste, fraud, and abuse, my colleagues would admit that Big Bird is not the problem. Big tech is, big pharma is, big insurance companies are. Elon Musk's companies make billions, $3 billion a year off of government contracts. That's 6 times the money that goes to all of public broadcasting. Private insurers and Medicare Advantage overcharged taxpayers $83 billion just last year. That could pay for public broadcasting 160 times over. The $4.5 trillion tax cut for the ultra-wealthy that Republicans on this committee are trying to push through, that would pay for public broadcasting 9,000 times over. There is money to pay not just for PBS and NPR, but health care for every American, tuition-free trade school and community college for every American, to end homelessness on the streets of our cities. But my Republican colleagues don't want to talk about the corporate waste, fraud, and abuse, because those corporations fund the Republicans' campaigns. So instead, they want to shut down educational programming for kids and their families, and they want to shut down local radio stations. To borrow a phrase from Sesame Street, the letter of the day is C, and it stands for corruption. Look, in my home city of Austin, Texas, we have Austin City Limits, which decade after decade after decade has chronicled American music. And if they had a bad season and it was private TV, they just would have shut it down. And we wouldn't have had decade after decade after decade of Austin City Limits. That's the amazing thing about public broadcasting. I have a lot of public housing residents in the San Antonio side of my district. And when I talk to them and they hear about what's going on in Washington, D.C., they talk about Texas Public Radio. And I just heard my colleagues talking about educational programming for kids on YouTube. That stuff is loaded with ads. And also on other forms of private television, they're selling you and your kids stuff, making people feel bad. They're trying to make a profit off of you. That's why I got sat in front of Mr. Rogers, because you got to learn something and they weren't just trying to sell you junk. It's better for our kids. It's better for our families. And we should actually be supporting public broadcasting instead of this stuff. Madam Chair, leave Elmo alone. Bring Elon in for questioning instead.
And I love how he said, Big Bird is not the issue, okay, when we look at waste, fraud, and abuse, when we're trying to cut down on that. It's big tech, big pharma, okay, big insurers, and so on and so forth. And it really comes down to corporations being able to buy their way into political offices. And whoever donates the most, that's who's going to benefit. And they're going to, this administration is going to make sure they're satisfied and they're going to get what they want. The other aspect that I really like was how he talked about all the money that we could be using to fund NPR and PBS and other things when it's going to, Elon Musk, his company's making billions of dollars. The $4.5 trillion tax cut for the rich that the Republicans are trying to get passed. Hello? All of those are examples of waste and in some cases corruption. We don't need all that money spent in those areas. They could be used so many other places. So yeah, Big Elmo, you know what I'm saying? Big Bird, they're not the issue. Mr. Rogers, they were never the issue. The most compelling part about Casar's testimony to me was how easily he laid out where the actual examples of abuse, corruption, fraud, and waste are. And what do you know? It's not with NPR and PBS. It's with Elon Musk. It's with Donald Trump playing golf, costing taxpayers millions of dollars. It's with all these government contracts that Elon is it funnels so that he can make himself richer and his companies. It's the private insurers overcharging the consumer. The tax cuts, the $4.5 trillion tax cuts for the rich that they want. That's where there's actual waste, fraud, and abuse. And what's scary, gutting public broadcasting stations disproportionately affects people who cannot afford the subscriptions and other fees associated with private news outlets. And that is a bad thing, because then you're going to have less intelligent, less informed people. Because with these private outlets, you don't know what agendas they're going to be on. But with public radio stations, public broadcasting stations, you have a pretty good idea of what you're getting and that you're going to be receiving accurate information that is rooted in substance and not propaganda, not rooted in kissing the ring of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. For Rebel HQ, I'm Chris Williamson. We'll see you next time.